Steve Rothstein, and I'm the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. And on behalf of all of the foundation team and the library team, we're thrilled to have you here for this special night. It is part of our centennial activities, celebrating the 100th anniversary of John Kennedy throughout the year. And I encourage you to look at the website, to look at other activities coming up, additional forums that will be on later in the year, and all kinds of activities throughout the year. I also want to recognize our sponsors, the lead sponsor, Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Infinity, and BUR. I also want to welcome our guests that are either watching us via streaming or on delayed through the radio, and appreciate all of their engagement as well. So there'll be roughly an hour of presentation and an opportunity for questions for each of you. Each one of these individuals, individually, we could listen to for hours because of their respective knowledge and information. And so, but let me first talk about David Gergen, and I think when I wake up in the morning or go to bed at night, I many times hear him on CNN. So I probably, if you add all those up, it probably is hours of wisdom that I've learned from all that he has shared. Particularly in these times where there's not a lot going on in the news, but he's talked about that. He also, in addition to CNN and many other things, he's a professor of public service and co-director of the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School. He is also, as many of you know, served as an advisor for four presidents. There are many people whose pinnacle of their career is to serve for one. But to serve for four from both parties is amazing. He's also a writer. The next page I'll cut out. I also want to introduce the secretary who served as the 13th Secretary of Energy from 2013 to 2017, and really made such an important impact because he brought such analytical thinking to that position and moved the country's debate on climate change so much forward, and on so much of what happened on the nuclear arms race. While his government work is impressive there and as deputy secretary, he also has an equally impressive academic career for over 4 decades. So with that, join me to welcome this distinguished panel. Thank you.
Thank you and good evening. Thank you for inviting us both here. We're both honored to join you this evening. It's especially good to come during the centennial year when there are so many celebrations, but particularly honored tonight to have Secretary Moniz with us. Thank you, Ernie, for joining this group. And let's get right down to serious business. I'm just curious how it is to be a man in America distinguished by the fact that 2 of you have the most talked about heads of hair in the country. How is that?
You and me?
Yeah, exactly. Well, mine has long vanished. Do people come up to you as they do to the president and say, "Is that real?"
Yes, I just had someone say, rather insultingly, "Gee, I have to get a toupee," suggesting that this was the case. But it was quite a hit in Washington for a while. And but I'll say 2 things. One is that, look, if it brought attention to our issues, it's fine with me. But secondly, I have to say there was an enormous creativity. I have created by congressional staff the famous Turnbull Declaration of Independence painting with each individual's face replaced by a different picture of me as a founding father. So
well, it was.
Which beat Quaker Oats and Sam Adams beer.
Right. And Beethoven.
Right.
He said he had the best head of hair in any cabinet since 1792. Now, you really did throw out the first pitch?
Absolutely.
A few years ago?
Yep.
A special picture, a special motion. Could we see what that looked like? What that motion looked like? Give us, stand up, people. I want to have a chance.
Should they guess who it is?
Yes, please.
Where you rotate?
Yeah.
Look up to God and wheel?
Yeah. Hey.
Louis Tiant.
Yeah. And how did it go? Did it get across the plate?
I have to admit, it was one of my staff, so you have to question it. But he did say you could hear the pop in the glove.
Terrific, terrific. So tell us, and you've just left government, and you must watch this, what's underway there with enormous interest. But as we meet tonight, the U.S. has warships steaming toward North Korea. We've just, fired for the first time missile into Syria. And just in the past 24 hours, we've learned that the United States has dropped a massive bomb in Afghanistan. How worried are you that we may be heading towards some kind of conflict somewhere?
Well, no, we're quite concerned. And in fact, if I go in particular to the nuclear security issues that obviously at the Department of Energy we are quite engaged in, a common statement, and one that I would endorse, is that the likelihood of a very, very, massive exchange of nuclear-tipped missiles has probably gone down substantially from the peak of the Cold War, or here at the JFK Library, the Cuban Missile Crisis. On the other hand, the probability of some nuclear weapon going off is probably much higher today. And that has many facets. One, of course, is the very simple fact that we are now much more concerned about not only nations, but subnational groups, terrorist groups, having access to materials. But even among the nation states, you have this extremely tense situation, obviously, with North Korea, but you have India, Pakistan, and frankly, we have a very less settled, shall we say, situation with Russia. As you know, certainly the United States is talking about violations of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, and we should remember the history of when that came into being. That was in the 80s, when you had the standoff between the Soviet Union and Western Europe, with a lot of short-range missiles ready to go off, tactical weapons on our side and their side, and in those days, the context was set by what was viewed as a very large asymmetry in conventional forces, with us being at the disadvantage. Now today, that has flipped, and that is a major driver of a changed dynamic in terms of the nuclear weapons enterprise in Russia, both in terms of the hardware, but also in terms of the use doctrine, which is very, very concerning. So
are you saying that it's really accelerated, they've accelerated? What is it that's setting off concern in your mind?
Well, there are new capabilities that are being developed in many ways, but I think my biggest concern in the end is what is sometimes called, they have been talking about this now for some time, the use of a nuclear weapon first as a way to decelerate a conflict involving conventional forces.
That's what the Russians are.
That's been said. But you can think of that scenario also applying potentially. Obviously, we hope it doesn't, but potentially, you can imagine that scenario applying in each of the cases I mentioned, North Korea and India, Pakistan as well. So I think we're at I think the important thing is we really need to have clarity, everybody returning to clarity, that the use of nuclear weapons is simply not in anyone's interest in the end.
Senator Markey has introduced a bill in the United States Senate that would call for no first use as a policy of the United States. Do you think, in effect, what we need is an international agreement on no first use?
Well, if we had a convincing, complete international agreement, that would be one thing. I think in the situation we're in right now, it requires, I think, much more of a negotiation and understanding what trade-offs are.
Would you think that the Markey bill is smart for the United States? Or do you think we ought to have ambiguity?
I think, personally, I think right now we need to have some ambiguity and negotiate. One of the problems is we're not negotiating. I mean, obviously the situation with Russia has probably as bad as it's ever been with Russia, for sure. But we also aren't talking to North Korea. Right. We have very, very limited leverage in terms of the India-Pakistan situation, where once again we are hearing about new use strategies coming into play potentially. Yeah. So it's unfortunate to say that I think the situation has really gone a little bit retrograde. You know, I don't know if you've looked at Bill Perry's, former Secretary of Defense Perry, his book, his writings, et cetera, but Bill Perry spent most of his career before he was Secretary of Defense in the nuclear deterrence game and being extremely important in that. He has said, gee, when I became Secretary of Defense in the early 90s, I figured, fantastic, we succeeded. Now my job is just to kind of clean it up.
Right.
And unfortunately, he now says, well, that's no longer the case. And he is committed, in particular right now, to try to do education, take the case, including through online courses, to young people especially, who have not been really aware of this risk and of the need to focus on threat reduction.
Right. Were you surprised when Secretary of State Tillerson said, basically with regard to North Korea, that negotiations are off the table, we've run out of patience, and now we have warships steaming there? Where are we heading here on this? And what should the administration be doing?
Well, I think the administration has stated, and the president has stated that, and President Obama stated that clearly China is in many ways the key partner for discussions with Korea. But I have to say, I think personally, having those discussions in some kind of trade-off space in terms of trade, for example, is certainly not the way I would recommend going about it.
Were you have you been surprised? I've been surprised with it.
Yes, and because I think, David, I think frankly, I have not seen any clear articulation or movement towards addressing the legitimate security concerns of China vis-a-vis the Korean Peninsula.
Well, President Trump said in the last 24, 36 hours that he believes China could easily take care of North Korea. He sat down with President Xi, who started reciting to him the history of China and North Korea. And after 10 minutes, President Trump realized it was much more complex than he thought. Yeah.
It turns out many things are more complex than some people.
So how again, tell us about the China angle and why that is so complex now. Why can't they just apply pressure? They got 150,000 troops apparently gathering on the northern border of North Korea.
Well, of course, the big leverage that China is ramping up is the economic pressure, the sanctions on coal exports from North Korea and the like. And I think there's no doubt that if China decided that it wanted to basically completely strangle their struggling economy, they could do that. But their concern then is complete instability and massive amounts of refugees and then a problem to deal with in terms of South Korea, U.S. presence, et cetera. So I think it is genuinely complex, and I think a stronger focus, again, as I said, on China's security concerns around a denuclearized peninsula.
So if we're denuclearized on both sides, they would feel safer.
They would certainly feel safer, but there are longer-term issues as well in terms of stability of the North regime and of what is going to be the American military presence.
So trying to get at this through trade is not going to get you as far as you need to get.
I don't think so, and I think it just muddles the issues. I think we need to really, one way or another, we're going to have to get into discussions, I should say, as opposed to negotiations, at least initially.
It's sort of
with
four power, five power kind of talk.
Probably a strong bilateral channel initially to set up the bilateral.
Between whom and whom?
United States and North Korea.
We may be waiting a while for that one.
Yeah, yes, apparently.
But to go back to this, just to be clear, what
Yeah.
President Trump has said in the last 2 or 3 days is that he's talked to the Chinese about a deal that if they will take care of North Korea, they'll get much more favorable trade deal with him, and he won't put this pressure on for a 45% tariff. I mean, there is the makings of a deal that could be part of this, but it doesn't seem to go anywhere close to the.
No, again, I think this needs to be discussed in the security space.
Right. If in fact, this is the same question we faced with Iran, if in fact the North Koreans get to the point where they do have a missile with this nuclear tip that could hit Los Angeles, and you were in the cabinet, what would you advise?
This is the perfect time to say I don't discuss hypotheticals. Again, there's no simple solution, and frankly, but the reality is we really can't let that happen. That capability cannot happen.
So the military option has to be on the table.
I think it has to be on the table. And that's where China has its concerns in terms of obviously an enormous military buildup, and then potentially a conflagration that leads to instabilities is a nightmare for them. So I certainly agree with the implication. They have very, very strong motivations to work with us, with North Korea, but obviously it's a complicated calculus. I think the issue of their wanting, kind of a more permanent buffer state also is not consistent with some of the other.
Graham Allison worries that if in fact we were to hit North Korea, that they would obviously fire their artillery and their short-range missiles at Seoul, which is not very far away, and millions of people would be killed, and that's why the South Koreans are much more in favor of negotiations than we appear to be.
Yeah, in fact, Graham has said, others have said as well, that we should remember that North Korea had a strong deterrence posture before they ever tested a nuclear weapon, just because of the reasons you say, and that's still there, which is why I also believe, when I say addressing the security issues, I think it's not a very sensible way to go to negotiate only the nuclear issue. It's got to be addressed in terms of all the security concerns of South Korea, North Korea, China, and Japan. And I think that's the dialogue that has not yet happened.
That's interesting. Well, I did want to come back to you about the agreements we've had in the past.
I'm sorry,
Sure.
David, may I just comment, because going back to what the discussion in terms of Russia and Europe, et cetera, just to note again there that in the 1980s, there was an asymmetry on the conventional side. Today, there's an asymmetry on the conventional side. It's just has flipped. And I think that points out, if you compare and if you then link that to the nuclear doctrines that we had in the 80s and Russia has today, it just shows the false choice in some sense, again, of trying to negotiate only nuclear. It's the overall security posture that matters,
right.
and the conventional and the nuclear play together in a very, very intimate way.
That's interesting. That leads into this question. For a good number of Americans, and I think back to the days when we negotiated an agreement with the North Koreans. I was there back in the Clinton days, when we got to an agreement, and it was the best of all options, it appeared to be at the time. But what we found is not only that agreement, but subsequently the North Koreans simply violated it over time. We've now seen very clear evidence that the Syrian negotiation with the Russians to get their chemical weapons out of there has failed. And that leads some people to worry about what's going on with the Iranian agreement. A lot of Americans are skeptical about whether agreements actually work over time. I mean, there's less confidence in the Iranian agreement, I think, in the populace than probably you feel about it, at least on the nuclear side.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Yeah. So walk us through sort of how do we get these agreements to a point where they not only get the nations to agree or the parties to agree, but we can also have more confidence in the publics about them.
I think one of the issues is maybe we haven't done enough a good enough job in explaining it. But, when people talk about the Iran deal, there's a lot of confusion, first of all. And we can come back to all of this, like most of the critiques of the deal are not of the deal, it's of what the deal is not, for example.
Yeah.
And we could go on and on with that. But on this specific point, you see a lot of focus on, the exact number of centrifuges and what their capacity is, et cetera, et cetera. And that's all important. Don't get me wrong on that. But the most important thing in the Iran deal is that it has unique verification and transparency measures. That is an absolute foundation of the deal. And that is not only for 10 or 15 years, by the way. There are some specific measures that, like uranium supply chain transparency. No one else has that requirement. And that goes for 25 years. They are committed to the additional protocol, which allows the IAEA access to undeclared sites forever. So transparency verification is important. Mm-hmm. That is exactly one of the things that was missing in the original North Korean deal, right? And the IAEA did have inspectors in North Korea, but where they could go was very, very restricted. Mm-hmm. In Iran, they have the additional protocol, so-called, again, which allows, in principle, any, you have to have some basis, but any place, and unique measures, as I say, for many, many parts of the activity. A controversial statement, not here, but in some other countries, I would make, is that a wonderful outcome of the Iran deal would be to see many of those unique transparency measures part of the regular safeguards regime everywhere. But again, that will get some serious argument pushback.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just to be certain we're all on the same page here, the Iranians have lived up to the nuclear part of the agreement?
Yes, the IAEA does a quarterly report, and they have. I mean, if you want to be, very precise, okay, it is true. I think the second report said that Iran has a negotiated limit of 130 tons of heavy water, and the IAEA estimated them to have 130.5. But that was pointed out. Iran sent out of the country 20 tons. To make it clear, there was a big headroom. So they did everything they had to do by January 16th of 2016. That's when the deal officially started, because the IAEA said, yes, they've done all the stuff they are required to do. And now, for over a year, they have sustained that commitment. So I think, I think that's going quite well, and it gives us, again, us and the international community, in my view, it gives us a lot of comfort in terms of there being no nuclear weapons program. If there is one, we have enormous tools because of the verification measures to see it, and the restrictions give us a considerable amount of time, like a year, to respond. So it doesn't require, before the agreement, they could go to a weapon quite quickly, and then the diplomacy is quite limited in that case.
But if they had a breakout, it would take a year.
Correct. So for the red line we had was, no matter how hard they went after it, it would take them at least a year for at least 10 years. And then there's a soft landing. After 15 years, there were no more restrictions on their nuclear activity, but there is still the continuing verification and transparency regime.
Mm-hmm. And the Israelis feel more confident today than they did?
Well, I would say they certainly should. And if you look at the views in Israel, there are obviously some who continue to not like the deal. Many former high-ranking defense and intelligence officials do like the deal. I think there's a lot of mischaracterization, such as, oh, this deal gives us time, but it guarantees that Iran will have a nuclear weapons program in 15 years. Well, that's an absurd
Why is that not
extension.
true? Tell us why that's not true.
Because there will still be very, very strong verification and transparency measures, number one. Number two, that is suggesting that one knows what the government of Iran will want to do in 15 years.
Right.
Okay? I don't ascribe to that. And third, there is a very, very strong international consensus about Iran not having nuclear weapons. Look, the negotiation was led by the United States, but it involved all the permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany, plus the EU. That was a period when the United States and Russia didn't exactly have fabulous relationships. Now, you can imagine, if you were negotiating for Iran, you would say, boy, this gives me a lot of wedge opportunities. Nothing. Complete solidarity in the negotiating team. That's a message in terms of the enormous risks, especially under the enhanced verification regime, that they would be taken to go in that direction. The last thing I'll say is, we should turn around. By the way, I read just recently, I wish I had known this last year, and I haven't checked it, I will admit, but that apparently, towards the end of the Ford administration, Henry Kissinger, in talking about Iran and proliferation, said something like, gee, hey, if we could get 10 years, that would be great. Well, that wasn't what I heard last year. But the fact that we have 10 to 15 years, I think we are derelict in our duty if we do not try to use that time to reshape the relationship.
But that also means their relationship with Syria, their relationship with Hezbollah.
Correct. And that goes back to why the critiques are not of the deal,
Right.
but why didn't you negotiate at the
so-
same time Hezbollah, Yemen, Syria,
Right.
human rights, missiles?
Bridges too far?
Absolutely. An analogy I draw is, okay, let's go back again to the 80s. Let's go back to the Reagan administration and my dear friend George Shultz, probably your dear friend as well. The United States and the Soviet Union had a whole raft of problems, including Jewish immigration and the like, proxy wars all over the place, right? What did they do? They negotiated arms control, right? An existential issue where you try to make progress and take that off the table. That was their strategy. That was the strategy here. I would also note that this was not exactly a secret strategy, that this was the nature of the Iran negotiation, which had gone on for years. I guess in diplomacy, the rules are a little bit fluid, but the reality is, if you didn't like that strategy, why didn't you complain 5 years earlier?
Right.
Right?
But how do we then, but your point is well taken about restoring more normal relations with Iran. I've wondered, for example, whether universities in this country shouldn't be, in effect, recruiting Iranian students to come here, whether we ought not to be building up more exchanges and more, things that would normalize the relationship. But is that possible, given their support of terrorism?
There actually are lots of Iranian students in the United States today. Absolutely.
Go ahead, please.
Frankly, I'll be honest. Now I'm back as part-time at MIT, and as I walk around there, a number of Iranian students, I don't mean Iranian American, I mean Iranian students, will stop, recognize me, and they say, thank you.
Yeah.
That these are the young people who are the hope. In fact, another anecdote, maybe worth saying,
Please.
is in 2002, the fall of 2002, just prior to the Iraq war, second war, we could choose different words, but whatever the case, in the House of Representatives, there was a hearing about the Iraq issue. One of the witnesses, not in government at the time, was a gentleman named Netanyahu. And he was very favorable about Iraq, the Iraq incursion. But he was asked a question about Iran. And you can look it up.
Yeah.
His statement was, other than Israel, Iran has the most open society in the Middle East. And the young people are the hope, basically. And the important thing is to keep those communication channels going. He mentioned, I call it the Melrose Place strategy, because that's what he mentioned. Let's just keep beaming Melrose Place in. But I think, obviously, it was a more general issue in terms of the more we have communications with the young people. He said that in 2002, and I think it's still right.
Just to underscore to you all that the Secretary's interest in these issues about the nuclear threat is much more than academic and goes beyond his time in government. But you've just signed up to be CEO and chair of the Nuclear Threat Initiative.
Co-chair.
Co-chair with
CEO,
Sam Nunn.
Yeah.
Tell us about that, how much time it will take, what you'll be doing, what you hope to achieve.
Well, it's about a half-time commitment. Fundamentally, I'm splitting my time between the nuclear threat and also a little chem bio thrown in, and the other half of my time will be on energy, clean energy, innovation, and climate. So the Nuclear Threat Initiative is basically that part of my activity. And the Nuclear Threat Initiative was established by Ted Turner and Sam Nunn in 2001. It's a relatively small, non-governmental organization, but it's distinguished by, I don't want to be pejorative about think tanks, but by being more of a do tank than a think tank. It's really focused on looking for, sometimes they may be small steps, sometimes bigger steps, but looking at real steps that where you can make progress in threat reduction. And the organization has done that. It played an important role in removing high-enriched uranium from Serbia and Kazakhstan. It mobilized Warren Buffett to put in major seed funds to establish a low-enriched uranium fuel bank in Kazakhstan. Yeah. The ribbon cutting is in August. And that's important because it's a tool to say to countries, you have no reason to go to enriching uranium yourself. You will have a guaranteed supply. It's done a security index, which has gotten a lot of attention. It's also doing, by the way, an index about security against disease threats.
Yeah.
So that's the organization. So in June, I will step into Sam Nunn's role of co-chair and CEO, conditional on Sam staying as a co-chair, so that we can work together on this. And as we said earlier, the problems have not gone away. Quite the contrary.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, but nobody ever thought at the time it would make that much difference. But removing nuclear weapons from Ukraine turned out to be a very wise, almost even prescient move.
I think most would agree.
Let's move to the other half.
Maybe some Ukrainians.
Let me say. So you're giving 50% of your time to nuclear threat, 50% of your time to climate change, and 20% of your time to the MIT. sort of Rick Perry math. But nonetheless,
well, 70 hours divided by 40 hours is 1.75.
So, okay. So let's turn to the climate issue, because you are dedicated to that as well. And you left the administration not very long ago, fairly optimistic. And since then, we've had some turns, in policy, clean power. We haven't walked away from the Paris Accords formally, but we seem to be edging away. And a budget that's gone up, and appointments, and EPA, but also budgets with regard to ARPA-E, I think you call it, that are threatening. Are you as optimistic now about the long term, or you have more caution? Where are you now?
I'm fundamentally as optimistic about the long term. I don't think there's any going back after Paris.
No status quo ante.
No status quo ante. I mean, the world is committed to going to a lower carbon future. I think the business community understands that, and that's an important point. The business community is not going to be allocating large amounts of capital for multi-decadal commitments because of statements made over a few months or even a few years.
You mean as coal-fired plants, for example?
For example, coal-fired plants, I mean, there it's maybe worth a little elaboration. The major reduction in coal use, and it has been quite major, it's been about a 40% reduction in coal use in the United States, has been driven mostly by cheap natural gas, not by policy. There's some effect, mercury rules, et cetera, but mainly it's cheap natural gas. That's not going to change. We see no indication of that changing. Not to mention the environmental impacts. So our strategy in the Obama administration, therefore, on coal wasn't a war on coal. It was a statement that, look, we firmly expect there to be a low-carbon future. So the question about coal is, what can we do now in the short term to help workers and communities? But for the longer term, what can we do to make coal part of a low-carbon future? And the key answer to that has to be developing the technology, further lowering the cost for capturing carbon dioxide after you burn coal or gas, any fossil fuel, and use it usefully and or dispose of it underground. And we know we can do it. It's a question, just like every other technology, like solar energy. Solar energy 20 years ago was enormously expensive. You keep working at it, and now it is straight up competitive in many environments. And it's growing very, very fast. So coal, we're much earlier in that innovation curve. But if we have that attitude, rather than an attitude of essentially doing nothing and praying, we're not helping coal, we're not helping a low-carbon future.
Yeah. You said something recently that I had not understood, that I found quite fascinating, and that is that if coal does make a comeback, which is encouraged by the administration, it's much more likely to take place in the West than in places like West Virginia. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so if you look at coal, obviously we have coal mining in the East, Appalachia, and we have a lot of coal mining in the West. They are very, very different approaches. In the West, it's essentially all, scraping big coal faces with giant machines and, roughly speaking, no jobs. In the East, you have a lot more of subsurface mining. In fact, the production of coal per worker in Wyoming, let's say, is nearly 10 times that of West Virginia. So if you then look at the president's executive order, want to bring coal back. It also had in it a part about, and furthermore, we are ending the moratorium on leasing coal mining, coal production on federal lands. If that actually became important, which I don't think it will be, but if it did, that means the West. And what you're doing is displacing job-intensive Eastern coal production for very job-light Western coal production.
So the policy that is under the new executive order would actually not help the miners in West Virginia.
Well, so I think the main reason why it's not going to have a big effect is that it's not going to lead to suddenly, a lot of new coal plants. I think what it may do clearly is it may keep some coal plants that were on the way out operating a few years longer.
Right.
But longer term, I just don't see that happening.
Let's go back to ARPA-E. Could you explain to everyone what that is and why that's relevant to the discussion of new technologies, say in coal and elsewhere, renewables?
Yeah, in fact, if I may, let me just give a little bit of a background on that.
Sure.
Going back to Paris, obviously we all know about, I think, and most of us at least celebrate the Paris agreements as being a major milestone towards a low carbon future. Another point we might want to discuss, a very important first step, but I do emphasize only a first step, the Paris Accord. But the point I want to make is that that accord, by definition, was the last day of the Paris meeting. The first day of the Paris meeting was another very important announcement. It was called Mission Innovation. It was a commitment by the countries that do almost all the energy technology research in the world to double those innovation budgets over 5 years. So innovation was placed at the center of the solution to climate change internationally. So that was a big deal. So now let me go to ARPA-E, and I'm going to come back and tie these together. So ARPA-E is a program. It stands for Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy. ARPA is for those in the R&D world, is a legendary Department of Defense office which pushed a lot of innovation. I won't go into it, but the idea is they operate in very different ways from normal government programs. So the ARPA-E was proposed and put into law in 2005 during the Republican administration. It was funded in 2009 with the Recovery Act. Since 2009, it has become, in some sense, kind of the face of innovation. It's not the only program, but it's been very, very successful. The first 200 projects that came out of ARPA-E, they're typically a few $1 million, slightly kind of pre-commercial technologies, take chances. 36 companies came out of those first 200 projects with well over $1 billion of private capital attracted to those companies. So, that's not the ultimate test. The ultimate test is, okay, in 10 years or 20 years, will one of those technologies have scaled up to be enormous? Right. But those are pretty good indicators, right? So I think what you're getting at is a couple things. One is Secretary Perry, my successor, has been very strong in talking about the importance of innovation and R&D and national labs, et cetera. He put out a very nice tweet about how ARPA-E was supporting exactly the kinds of innovators we need in this country. Unfortunately, I think within a week, the OMB came out with a budget that's proposed zeroing out this incredibly successful program. 2 points. One is, obviously, look, it's just a statement of fact. The administration's got a ways to go yet to get all the signals aligned. But secondly, more importantly, what I would say is, I said earlier at least, we're going to low carbon. We are seeing already, we will be seeing even more, a multi-trillion-dollar market in those technologies globally. The spoils of that will go to the innovators. It would be a terrible irony if we were the ones, frankly, who drove the establishment of Mission Innovation, which I should have said, in addition to the national commitments, had a group of 28 international investors lined up to say, yeah, and we're eager to come into this expanded innovation pipeline. It would be ironic if, having done that, we were the ones who then slashed our innovation budgets and invite everyone else to go forward. Why don't you get a bigger market share? It will be unfortunate if, 20 years from now, we hear words repeated from what we hear today. How come China has got a big market share if we caused it in this space?
Yeah. You had interesting numbers somewhere about how many jobs have been lost in coal versus how many jobs have been created by renewables.
Yeah, in coal, I think the number right now is about 20 to 25,000 coal mining jobs have been lost in the country. We are now up to, and most of it's in the last few years, we're now up to about 280,000 solar jobs. But
That have been created.
That have been created.
In basically the same time frame.
Well, maybe it's 200,000 in the same time frame, yeah.
Okay.
But
Right.
it's a significant multiplier. But so having said that, however, I will point out two issues. One is, of course, the geography of the job loss and the job gain is quite different. So 85% of the job loss, not surprising given our earlier discussion, is in Appalachia, which is where the job-intensive mining occurs. And the solar jobs, the biggest concentration of those is California, Nevada, Massachusetts, and New York. So very, very different profile, and that's what causes a lot of worker and community and regional stress, which I don't think we have done anywhere near enough to address.
This is sort of the hillbilly elegy.
Hillbilly elegy problem, exactly, or the stranger in their own land problem, et cetera. So I think that's really really a serious issue. And secondly, I have to admit that I think the salaries for a lot of those solar jobs are not at the same scale as the mining jobs or other advanced manufacturing jobs. So that leads to other social issues we need to address in terms of equality and the like.
So
May I just say, David?
Sure.
Yeah, may I just say that I would encourage you and the audience to really look up a transcript on the internet of a conversation on the White House South Lawn in October 2016. It involved Leonardo DiCaprio, President Obama, and a climate scientist, Katherine Hayhoe. But my point is, in the middle of this discussion about climate and its impacts, the president, I think, President Obama, it's a couple of pages of the transcript, made some very interesting comments. Commented about fracking. Said, look, I know a lot in this audience don't like fracking, but let's remember it's done an incredible job for our economy, it's created a lot of jobs, and it has lowered CO2 by displacing coal.
Right.
So what we need to do is get the environmental footprint of producing minimized. Number two, he said, and this goes to the hillbilly elegy kind of story, he said, imagine I'm talking to a working class dad who drives 50 miles each way to work every day to try to, keep the family budget going, and you want me to tell him how bad it's going to be in 50 years. Ain't going to register. So he said, we need to bring along political coalitions of everybody, and if we are going to get to where we want to go as rapidly as we can, which unfortunately will not be as rapidly as some of us would like. And certainly no one can question President Obama's understanding and commitment to these issues. But he said, look, unless we start thinking about these people and bringing them along, looking at regional solutions, we're just not going to get there. We're just going to keep running into headwinds. So I think that's a very, very important area. It's certainly an area that I'm planning to focus on.
So, but the way the federal government's organized, the Energy Department doesn't worry a lot about. I mean, it comes up with answers about how do you get to a low carbon world, but it's not really preoccupied with the people.
Well,
and
it wasn't.
Yeah, and artificial intelligence.
3.5 years ago.
Yeah.
One of the first things we did was we established something that we call the Job Strategy Council, and recruited an excellent person. He was the founding executive director of the Blue-Green Alliance, labor and environmental groups.
Yeah.
And we took a number of steps that were exactly in this direction. For example, I'll give you one example. Does it change everything? Immediately, no, but we formed an alliance with, in this case, with labor unions to develop the information such that when states prepared their clean power plans, That's the coal regulation plan. When they did those, the unions could work with them to maximize job creation in those plans. So that's the kind of thing. It's not like, you can solve everything overnight. But
Right.
working with that goal in mind, there's more creative things you can do than might be immediately obvious.
What I think I hear you saying, though, is that the energy revolution put a lane over the top of the revolution, say, artificial intelligence, which is, and what's coming on those technologies.
Yeah.
The combination can really spell deep trouble with your society, and that's where you get your populism. That's where you get your anger.
Correct.
And the sense that the government has forgotten us.
Yes, and certainly in the climate world, I think we need to think a little bit more along those lines, but recognizing that that's only one part of a bigger set of transformations and pressures. Look, I think for many in our workforce, and we can have our own ideas as to which demographics they might be, but for many in our workforce, the clock speed of a lot of these changes is just dizzying. And now on top of it, I'm saying we also need in my view, we need a very deep decarbonization in the United States on kind of a generational timescale.
So how late are we? We're going to go to the floor here in just a moment, and so be prepared with your questions if you might. But how late are we in dealing with climate change? How caught are we by what's already happened?
We're late. There's clearly a lot of inertia built up in the system already, and we are certainly. Look, in Paris, there was an adopted goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise. We're already at 1 roughly, maybe 2. It's not going to be easy. However, let me give a slightly more sophisticated answer. What we know, what our human activity is doing is changing the concentration of greenhouse gases. Let's say CO2 in the atmosphere. A lot of the discussion that goes on would suggest that, if you double the amount of CO2, you will lead precisely to a 2.2 degree rise in average temperature. Well, that's not correct. Our understanding would be of a distribution. And what I want to emphasize is that, sure, we've got to work really hard to get to that 2 degrees or lower, if we can. But we have to also recognize it's important to do as well as we can and not throw up our hands and say, we'll never get to, we can't do 1.5 degrees. The reason being, go back to that distribution as a kind of a semi-physics joke, it's always the tails that kill you, right?
Yeah.
And so if you work on getting that CO2 concentration down, you are really cutting off those tails, which is where the biggest dangers would lie. So it's a balance. You don't want to take your foot off the pedal, but you also got to recognize that it's important to do all that we can. The less we do, the more we will have to spend the money in adapting. And that's already happening. Again, I'll give us an anecdote. One utility in Florida is prone to the effects of rising sea level and storms, et cetera. One utility in Florida had a major improvement in its ability to serve customers when the last Hurricane Matthew, was it, I think, went through. Yeah, well, that came by spending, from one utility, billions of dollars to harden the system. One utility in Florida.
Wow.
So, mitigation, reducing the threat, reducing the risk is by far the best strategy.
So,
Pay me now or pay me later.
but now, even as you have this optimism, I wonder how troubled you are by the discourse we have and the rise of what some now call alternative facts.
Mm-hmm. I am terrified by it, and frankly, I think in many ways I'm much more concerned that the disregard for facts and for scientific evidence, I'm much more concerned about that than I am about some of the specific steps that are being taken. Mm-hmm. And that's because the disregard of facts ultimately is a challenge to the core of democracy. How can you have democracy if you can't agree on facts in a certain sense? You can have very different views in terms of policy, how fast you go on something, whatever. But if you can't even agree on the facts, I don't get how the society functions. So I think that is a critical thing, well beyond what we're just discussing tonight in terms of say climate denial. And I think also even on that, I think we haven't done a very good job apparently because again, I think it was my first hearing when this came up. I said I'm not here to debate what's not debatable, namely that the scientific basis. Let me phrase it carefully. Certainly the scientific basis to say that the only prudent response a government can make is to address these issues has long been there. And it's got nothing to do with highly complex models. So that would lead one to say, okay, you can argue about how fast you do this, et cetera, but you shouldn't be arguing about the need to address this. It's really disheartening, frankly. Yeah. I'm much more optimistic about the technology solutions that will lead to the problems
than
I am about this discourse.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to the floor. I think there are microphones here. Let's see. Yeah, there are a couple here. And if you would, please identify yourself. Be fairly brief. And remember that a question ends with a question mark. Please.
Hi, my name is Kathy Buckley. I'm a volunteer here, and I also chair the Massachusetts Sierra Club. My main concern is climate, and yet I want to go back to the nuclear question. President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and at the time they were well ahead of public opinion, of the Senate here, of the military and intelligence communities. Kennedy essentially did in secret with Averell Harriman over in Moscow. What are the dynamics today? We don't have a Kennedy in the White House today. What are the dynamics, the groups, what's going to happen to help us move in the right direction? Is it the military, the intelligence community, our politicians, our public?
For the comprehensive test ban?
Well, for really moving in the right direction in terms of test ban, as well as anything else on the nuclear front.
Well, first, so let me focus directly on the testing, okay? And first of all, in my view, the comprehensive, if we could get the comprehensive test ban treaty ratified, in my view, it would be unquestionably to the benefit of everybody, of the world, certainly for the United States. Now, in 1999, the Senate held hearings on the comprehensive test ban treaty, and it was roundly rejected. It didn't even get a majority of the vote, let alone 2/3 of the vote. I think that it is time now to revisit that, because when all is said and done, there were two fundamental reasons for the rejection in 1999. I would argue both are OBE. One was that the science-based program that the Department of Energy had to develop to confirm the reliability and safety of the stockpile was only in its infancy. And it was going to take about 10 more years to establish it. It's happened. We're now 25 years past testing, and our national lab directors absolutely certify the safety and reliability of that. So That's gone. The second one was that there was no, at that time, global detection network for underground tests. That's now essentially complete as well, the seismic. So I would argue it's time to look up and say, and notice that, wait a minute, those reasons are not there. And the geopolitics of it, I think, clearly works in our interest to have that done. So I don't know, I may be Pollyannish, thinking that maybe there'll be a chance to revisit this in a few years.
Please.
My name is Martin Heyman. I'm from Newton, and I'm a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby. Many of us believe that the future improvement in climate control will come from the grassroots, or conversely will not come from Washington. What would be, and there are so many very acceptable and wonderful organizations arising now to control climate and to improve climate. There are so many working at cross purposes. What would you recommend politically to make some kind of coordination of these grassroots movements to become effective in the climate change movement? And conversely, would you use another 25% of your time to become the leader of that group?
First of all, I would say I believe the federal government will lead in the traditional sense of find out where the people want to go and then lead them there. So I think this bottom-up approach is absolutely critical. And frankly, I think it is working. We're not where we want to get yet, but I think there's no question that greater and greater fractions of the population in the country recognize that there's an issue. They're not ready to act on it, and part of the reason is this complex set of other issues that lead to anger and various other approaches. But I want to point out, I think that mayors are critical, and the mayors a lot of mayors in the United States, red and blue states, and globally, are really stepping out forward in an important way. That's very important.
Is it Bloomberg?
Bloomberg, yeah, Bloomberg. That's a big city.
Yeah.
No, but Bloomberg is it. But it's a fantastic network, and I think that's where again mayors are very close to their people and the problems, and so I think that's critical. But also in the United States, when I talked about why I think we may have a blip in the road, but I think we're heading in the right direction ultimately. I mentioned the business community as an important part of that, but I didn't finish and say that also the states are incredibly important. So, for example, again, in the United States, the states with mandatory renewable portfolio standards represent 70% of the population. And if you add to it the additional 8 states that have non-mandatory but standards, then you get up to 80% of the population. So most of the country actually is in fact living under a set of directives that support the direction you want to go in. And of course, another very practical, on the energy side, thing to do is to keep emphasizing the importance of both energy efficiency and energy conservation. And again, this state I think is still ranked number 1, by the way, in that, which is great. So I think there's a lot we can do in that direction. Eventually, there'll be what's called the percolation phenomenon, and it'll percolate and it'll all come together, and the federal government will lead. And also the other. I'm sorry, Dave. But the other thing I'll just say is that because the other part of it is that innovation agenda, again, there's other facets, but I want to emphasize is leading, will lead to this continued cost reduction. One should not underestimate the lowering of the barrier to policy when it doesn't cost much. Right?
Please.
My name's Andy Arison. I'm from Walpole. I recently read an article about the significant improvement in the targeting and fusing of U.S. submarine-based nuclear weapons that allows them to hit much more accurately the specific Russian silos. How do you think that'll affect Russia's view on things, if we can hit them more accurately?
Yeah, I know you're referring to an article about fusing systems, basically. I personally, I don't think that is the dominant issue here. I think you mentioned Russia specifically. Russia has got dramatically enhanced defensive capabilities. Number one. Number two, as we discussed earlier, they are also developing a lot of novel offensive capabilities. I can't say too much about it. One that has been in the paper is that allegedly there was a leak from Russia about a possible underwater vehicle, for example, that could open up new capabilities. So anyway, I think, frankly, in the end, this is a political issue, and we need to get and frankly, I feel, look, we have plenty of problems with Russia, obviously, and I guess Russia with us as well, I suppose. But I just am of the camp, certainly, that we cannot afford to stop talking about nuclear issues. One of the things my colleague Sam Nunn, for example, has been trying very, very hard. We do not have direct top-level military-to-military communication anymore. Really? No. And you know, you got to know who to call. So you know, I just think we need to we maybe, if we can't solve all the problems, we just have got to get in this security realm reestablish communications. The organization that I'm going to be CEO of in June, NTI, just put out, working with a Russian institute, put out a document, a report that lists over 50 concrete actions for collaboration in the nuclear sphere that we believe we should and could do now, despite all the other disagreements, and get that going again. Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. In fact, you know, just even the last couple of years, when I was secretary, we worked with Russia. We did work with Russia, and we evacuated all of the high enriched uranium out of Vietnam back to Russia, which is where it came from, and that made Southeast Asia HEU free. That's the kind of thing we need to do more of. Sure. You know.
Well, with all these generals in the government.
Yes, they're the ones.
Maybe there's a possibility.
No, they're the ones who should be talking.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
Right.
Please, sir.
My name is Brian Moriarty from Duxbury. I have two questions. The first one is about North Korea. And you mentioned bilateral talks with the U.S. and North Korea. And I would question that because really we don't have the leverage. The only country that has leverage is China. And with China, my question is, how can we influence them? What leverage do we have with them, since we're going to have trade barriers? How can we influence them to go along with us? They have fears about instability, which are very genuine. And we know, we have suffered in the West from causing instability in Syria, Iraq, and so on. So we know that stability is very important in this world. So I understand the Chinese, and we've got to understand the Chinese. So should we ask the Chinese to reduce the coal exports by 50%, 80%? You can't say 100% because then the regime will go down. And my second question is more complex. There are a lot of... Okay. I'll make it less complex.
Well, when I answer the first one first.
Okay.
Just to say that, look, I should really clarify. I did not mean negotiations in a bilateral, in a formal sense. I probably should have said conversations. We need to have channels of communication to see where there are openings. And because when it gets to, I guess, if you want to say negotiations, then we clearly need our allies, South Korea and Japan, have obviously got to be integral to that, as well as China. So what I really mean is that there doesn't seem to be, it doesn't even have to be track one. It could be track 1.5. Those conversations. I think realistically, until we do that, I'm not sure we're going to be set up to go back to the multilateral negotiating framework. That's my issue there.
But my question also is China. China is a place that has leverage. Can we, and you recognize that, and we all recognize that, can we have leverage with the Chinese to do the good work? And what leverage do we have with them?
What's the next question?
Okay, I will get to the next question. Next question is climate change. So in my acquaintanceship, there are lots of people, not lots, there are some people, a few people, who are climate deniers. And your colleague, Richard Lindzen, and Professor Lindzen of MIT, is a climate denier, as you know. So there are some scientists, and he's a meteorologist, he's not a guy who looks at the ground. So there are some people in the science community who are against the idea of climate change. So my question to you is, number one, I would like there to be some forum, maybe the American Academy of Science or something, where you can say, okay, out of the 100 scientists, just one believes in global warming, and the other 99 believe it's true. The other thing is, how do you present it to the public? So that's number one, to the public. Okay, only 1% of people don't believe it. The other thing is, how do you present it graphically? Could it be that the seacoast in Boston is going to rise, the sea level is going to rise by, a foot or something? How can you make it graphic to people? So two questions. One, how can we present, blah, blah. Sorry, okay, I know. Thank you.
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd be rich. Obviously we have not cracked the code in terms of making the communications more broadly available. But I do want to emphasize, you say some scientists believe and some don't believe. Well, first of all, I want to emphasize this is not about religion, or it shouldn't be about religion. And the word believe may not be the most precise. I think even Mr. Lindzen, I think if you look carefully, it's not like there's complete disagreement in terms of the scientific basis. He would have some differences in terms of the consequences. What I would go back is to simple stuff. First of all, for example, the implications on average temperature rise globally for a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere was calculated in the right ballpark in the 19th century. It's like everybody's, we got these complicated models. Hello, it's only been like 120 years since that was calculated. Number two, another possibly memorable phrase from one of my hearings, I know how to count. I know how to count how much CO2 we are emitting from human activity, fossil fuel combustion, some land use issues, et cetera. And I know how to count that if we emit CO2 from human activities at the rate we are doing, we would reach that doubling very, very soon. We get a bit of a reprieve because the carbon cycle net has the increase in the atmospheric concentration at about half of the rate that we are emitting, because the oceans and land are absorbing CO2, right? We don't know if that will persist forever. That is part of the scientific, not fully resolved stuff. But even if I put that in, I put in that, let's say, factor of 2. We're talking about, roughly mid-century to reach the doubling, creating the several degrees, the degrees of centigrade of warming. It's not complicated. Third is then, okay, what's the implication then of warming of that magnitude? And some things are very easy to do, like sea level rise. That's not a big mystery, and there will be sea level rise. We know what that means. There'll be warmer waters. We know that higher, warmer waters will amplify the effects of storms. Even if I don't talk about the frequency of storms, they're just going to amplify the damage, like Sandy, for example. Okay. Then there are other effects that we can infer from the historical record what a few degrees means, and then there are other effects that are more difficult in terms of high resolution regional impacts. So that's what I was saying earlier. I don't have to get into very advanced computer modeling to establish the basis for a prudent response. I don't think I need to know much more than I just told you to say that. Unless you can tell me how this default option is somehow magically removed. You've never heard any of the so-called deniers tell you how to avoid those consequences. Until you do, why aren't we being prudent in shaping the low-carbon future?
So instead of saying scientists believe, scientists know.
Analyze, know, conclude, right. And there are some things where there are genuine uncertainties. Certainly, when you go to more and more regional impacts, it gets more and more difficult to be confident. But again, even there, the reality is, by and large, if you look at the IPCC, the group of scientists that have come together, they have always been on the conservative side, precisely because they are scientists. And many of the effects we are seeing at the high end of the range that they felt would be reached. So again, I just think this should not be religion. It really even shouldn't be politics, other than deciding what are the policy and political steps you take, how much, how fast.
What does prudence mean?
What's prudent? That's right. Yeah.
Please. We're going to have time for a couple more questions. We'll try to get through everybody standing, but we're going to go for it.
My name is Roland Sear. I'm from Atkinson, New Hampshire. My question goes to the all of the above strategy in terms of energy production, which I believe is still our policy in the United States. Out of the fossil fuels, the panoply of fossil fuels that are part of that, what is your opinion in projecting forward the chances that coal will be a long-term player in contributing to our energy?
Well, so the question was about the so-called all-of-the-above strategy, and it's something certainly that I advocated and the President did, namely that we need every tool at our disposal to address the low-carbon future, especially recognizing that there's no one solution. That's another fallacy often, that the solutions will look very different in different regions of our country and different countries. So having said that, in the United States, we already made one point about natural gas being a major part of our lowered CO2 emissions because of the displacement of coal. I do want to emphasize that since I also advocated or said that I think we will need to go to very deep decarbonization, eventually natural gas will be too carbon intensive also, and we'll need to capture the CO2 from gas use. So coal, now comes right back to what I said earlier. It's hard to see any other solution for coal in a low-carbon world than capturing the CO2. Now, up to now, in the United States, we use about 60 million tons of CO2 per year to produce more oil. So it gets injected, and it displays in old oil fields, and it produces more oil, about 300,000 barrels a day. There are shaky estimates that that could be enhanced by up to a factor of 10. If that's the case, that's a pretty big chunk of carbon dioxide being taken out and put to an economic end, because obviously the oil is worth something, right? So that's a possibility. Another possibility is you just dispose of it in very deep saline aquifers. And a DOE supported a plant, an ethanol plant in Illinois that just started up, I think, last week to do that kind of disposal of the CO2. And then third, there's a more of a holy grail, perhaps, in which very large amounts of CO2 from, say, a coal plant or industrial plants can be captured and utilized at very large scale in other ways, economically, like building materials. Now, we're nowhere close on that economically, okay? But it's an innovation problem, again. If we don't apply ourselves with innovation and broad-based innovation, then it's a self-defeating, then we know the answer, right? So that's where the coal supporters should be putting their emphasis, I think, and it's what we did in the Obama administration. We put $6 billion into advancing this kind of carbon capture.
Was that under ARPA-E, or was that a whole separate program?
No, that was a separate program.
Yeah.
ARPA-E funded some novel, new ideas. Okay. Carbon capture, so you capture the carbon, and then you store it somehow, right? The cost center is the capture. And so what ARPA-E did was funded some novel ideas about whole new ways of doing the capture in ways that one or the other might come through and be much less expensive.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Let's see. Did you just end up? You slipped up there on me, but I wasn't looking. We may not get to you. Please.
Hi. Good evening. This is Ken Kimmel. Thank you for being here tonight. I think I speak for myself, but I imagine others. It makes us all miss having a scientist in a top position in the federal government hearing you.
March for science.
I wanted to talk a little bit. I heard your hope and optimism about energy efficiency and cleaning up the grid and getting cheaper electric generation, and there are obvious, really heartening successes. But, transportation emissions have now become the top source of greenhouse gases, and I'm fearful that some of the trends aren't going in the right direction, with people buying much more gas-guzzling vehicles, with the automakers souring a bit on the fuel economy standards that they agreed to a few years ago. And I'm wondering, what do we need to really lock down that sector of the economy in a way that we've been more successful with the electric sector? Is it policy? Is it innovation? Is it carbon pricing? How do we get at that next big major source?
Let me make a broader statement. I'm sorry if I have a few minutes,
Sure.
And then get specifically to your question, but because I think you raised a very important point. Earlier I said Paris was a very important first step. So Paris, typically countries pledged 25, 30% reductions by 2030, let's say, would be typical. With what we see today, pushing hard, we can see how to get there. And the electricity sector is an enormous part of that. But if we go to beyond that, to the deep decarbonization period, as I'm calling it, say to 2050, 2060, electricity sector is enough. You got to do transportation, you got to do industry, you got to do the buildings, right? The reason you always hear about electricity is because electricity is the easiest to do. There are many, many options for low-carbon electricity. Wind, solar, nuclear, natural gas that's carbon light compared to coal, et cetera, right? So now your inference is, because I would say it's exactly right on, transportation is a lot harder. I would argue industry is even harder. Retrofitting buildings on a large enough scale is pretty hard. But let's focus on transportation. That's what you, and I have, and anyway, I would add something else, but let's, transportation. So I think we will clearly make some progress on electrification of light-duty vehicles. And obviously with a low-carbon electricity system, then that's going in the right direction. But the reality is we're not going to electrify the entire transportation system. It doesn't violate any law of physics to do it, but I don't think you're going to see a lot of jumbo jets with electricity. And you know, there's a very fundamental problem, or not problem, challenge. It's very difficult to imagine a more ideal fuel for transportation than gasoline, other than the emissions. Because gasoline, you think about it, anyone in this room, or almost anyone in this room, has no problem going to a self-serve gas pump. Think about it. That's a fuel of incredibly high energy density that you can handle at room temperature, room pressure, you know. You know, if you think about the power, the energy flowing through that nozzle, you're approaching 10 megawatts. That's why it's hard to displace, okay? So the reality is we're going to have to find other solutions to complement electrification, certainly for heavy vehicles, again, airplanes and the like. For example, here's another holy grail from, and by the way, part of it also would be, especially in urban settings, different transportation systems, different ownership models, but then again, that's always going to be electric vehicles, maybe autonomous vehicles. But for example, okay, here's a big moonshot. Combine carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight to produce a hydrocarbon fuel. And drop it in. Now, violates no laws of physics. It's being done. But it's not being done at any cost or scale that is relevant to the problem today. But that's, again, it's the same story. You got to keep at the innovation and look for some of these big breakthroughs. So it's hard, so you're right, but a combination of policy and some of these breakthrough technologies, I do believe we will ultimately need some kind of replacement liquid fuel for some of these major transportation applications.
Mr. Secretary, I'm getting signals that we have overrun our time for the various outlets which carry this great program. I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. This is an extraordinarily important time, year in the life of this library. And it's good to see all of you here. I hope you'll come back. You heard about the great programs.
I think we should say happy birthday, JFK.
Oh, happy birthday, JFK. We will not sing. Although he could do that too, as well as pitching. But I do think we saw tonight why Ernest has been called the secret weapon of the Obama administration, because he can speak with such clarity in a way which is understandable to so many of us on issues which are in fact terribly complicated but extraordinarily important to our future. And I think that I am just so pleased that you're not only going back to MIT, but you're going to continue to devote your life to these causes.
Thank you.
So thank you for all that you've done, and I thank you for coming in. Thank you.